On the edge of the prairie, where the land stretched endless and the sky burned with colors no painter could capture, a man traded only a handful of coins for a cabin that time itself had forgotten. Weathered wood, creaking beams, and a door that groaned like it carried the weight of every storm. No one else wanted it. To the townsfolk, it was worthless, a ruin swallowed by weeds and silence. But to him, a lonely ranch hand with nothing but calloused hands and hollow nights, it was a chance at something more than drifting through an unforgiving west. He had no illusions. The cabin was cheap because it was broken, windows cracked, roof sagging, floorboards whispering with every step. Yet as he walked across the porch and pushed open the door for the first time, he felt a strange pull, as if the walls held secrets buried deeper than the dust. The smell of cedar lingered faintly, mingled with smoke, as though fires had once burned bright within. He thought he was walking into emptiness, into a silence he had long grown used to. But what waited beyond that door would shatter the quiet he thought he had bought. The air inside was still, heavy with the scent of years gone by. Light trickled through broken shutters, carving pale stripes across the wooden floor. And then, in the corner, where shadow met sunlight, he saw her, a figure that did not belong to dust or decay. A woman, her hair cascading like dark rivers, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and defiance, stood as though she had been waiting. She was no ghost, no trick of the light, but flesh and breath, a stranger as beautiful as she was out of place. The ranch hand froze, his hand still on the latch, his heart thundering louder than the cicadas outside. For years, he had learned that the West gave nothing freely, that every gain carried a cost. Yet here, in a cabin bought for a few coins, stood a mystery too great to measure. Who she was, how she came to be there, those answers were locked behind her gaze, a gaze that seemed to weigh his very soul. In that moment, the lonely cabin ceased to be a bargain. It became a doorway to a story far larger than the man who had dared to open it. And as the wind howled through the prairie grass, he understood one thing with unsettling clarity. The West was about to test him not with drought, nor with bullets, but with the haunting presence of a stranger who would change everything he thought he knew about survival, trust, and fate. The silence between them stretched, heavy and sharp, as the man stood in the doorway of the cabin he had thought was his alone. The woman did not move, her figure outlined by a shaft of pale light cutting through the broken shutters. She looked too solid to be a dream, too fragile to be a threat, and yet her presence unsettled him more than a dozen armed men could have. His breath caught in his throat as he stepped inside, the old floor groaning beneath his boots. Every instinct told him to demand answers, but something in her eyes, fear mixed with defiance, stilled his tongue. Her voice came at last, low and cautious, like a whisper she had not meant to speak aloud. "You shouldn't be here." The words struck him harder than he expected. For a man who had paid his coins and carried the deed, this was supposed to be his refuge, his claim against the wilderness. But the West had a cruel way of reminding men that land and would carried secrets older than any paper. He studied her, searching for signs of trickery, for the possibility that she was bait in some cruel trap. Yet the longer he looked, the more he saw truth in the trembling of her hands, the hunger in her hollow cheeks. He asked her name, his voice rough from disuse, and she hesitated as though the question itself was a blade. Finally, she spoke it, soft and uncertain, as if even her name had grown thin from loneliness. She told him little else, offering no explanation for how she came to be there, only that she had nowhere else to go. Her words carried the weight of exile, of doors closed in her face, of a world that had left her behind. And though he did not fully believe her, he recognized the look in her eyes, because once he had seen it in his own reflection. The ranch hand moved carefully, circling the cabin with the wariness of a man who knew the cost of trust. Every step he took was deliberate, his hand never straying far from the revolver at his side. Yet with each breath, the reality settled deeper into his bones. This stranger was not merely trespassing on his land, but on his life. She was a piece of a story he had not chosen, and yet one that had chosen him the moment he opened that door. That night, as the sun sank into the horizon and the prairie burned orange with the fading light, the man lit a lamp in the cabin. Its glow fell across both of them, casting long shadows against the walls. For the first time in years, the cabin was not silent. The stranger sat across the room, her baby blue eyes reflecting the flicker of the flame, while the man leaned against the table, his mind restless. The West had given him a cabin for a few coins, but it had also given him a riddle wrapped in the form of a woman, one that could either save him from his loneliness or drag him into a storm he could not yet see. Morning came with a chill that seeped through the cabin's cracks. The man awoke early, his instincts honed from years of labor, only to find the stranger already awake, standing near the window. She looked out toward the prairie, her expression caught somewhere between longing and dread. He studied her in silence, realizing with a strange pang that she did not seem like a thief or a schemer. She seemed like someone who had been waiting, though for what, or for whom, he could not yet tell. Over breakfast, made from the meager supplies he had brought with him, she finally spoke more. Her words were halting, but her story slowly unfolded. She had once belonged to a family on the other side of the plains, but tragedy and betrayal had left her cast out, stripped of home and kin. The cabin, she confessed, had been her refuge for weeks, perhaps months, though she had stopped counting time. She lived off what little the land gave her, surviving each day with no promise of tomorrow. To her, the cabin was not property, it was salvation. The ranch hand listened, his face unreadable. He knew the West was filled with stories like hers, stories carved by hunger, loss, and desperation. Yet hearing it from her lips stirred something unexpected within him. He had come here for solitude, for a place to bury his past and live unnoticed. Instead, he found himself staring at a reminder that loneliness was not unique to him, that others carried it too, often heavier, often harsher. Her presence in the cabin was no accident. It was as if fate itself had placed her there, daring him to face what he had long avoided. Still, suspicion lingered. The West did not forgive men who trusted too quickly, and kindness was often the quickest way to a grave. He asked her bluntly if anyone else knew she was there, if someone might come knocking on the door next with a rifle in hand. She shook her head, her voice breaking as she swore she was alone. There was no one left to seek her, no one left to follow. Her words rang with the kind of truth that needed no proof, and for the first time, the rancher allowed himself to believe them. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon once more, the two sat in silence by the fire. No longer strangers, yet not companions either. They shared a space that neither had expected to find. The cabin, once abandoned and worthless, now held two broken souls bound together by chance. And in the quiet crackle of the flames, the rancher realized something unsettling. The coins he had paid had not bought him solitude at all. They had bought him a story, one that had only just begun to unfold. The days that followed carried a strange rhythm, one the ranch hand had not known in years. He rose at dawn, his hands busy with repairs, patching the roof, mending the sagging fence, chopping wood to keep the fire alive. The woman moved quietly within the cabin, sweeping the dust, cooking what little food they had, and humming softly to herself when she thought he could not hear. Their words to each other were few, but the silence between them was no longer sharp and hollow. It had shifted, softened, as though the cabin itself had begun to breathe again. Still, questions haunted him. At night, when the prairie was swallowed by darkness and the coyotes howled across the plains, he wondered what dangers might come with her presence. Was she truly alone? Or was she hiding from someone whose shadow might one day fall across his door? In the West, every story carried a hidden chapter, and every kindness risked unraveling a man's life. Yet each time he saw her sitting by the fire, her eyes reflecting both fear and resilience, he could not bring himself to turn her away. The woman, for her part, sensed his doubt. One evening, she offered him the truth he had not asked for, a name, a family, and a betrayal that had cut her deeper than any blade. She had trusted the wrong man, believed promises that turned to dust, and when tragedy struck, she was cast aside as though her life had no value. Her words were raw, her voice trembling as she spoke, but she did not ask for pity. She asked only for understanding. And in that moment, the ranch hand realized her presence in the cabin was not mere chance. It was the echo of his own exile, mirrored in another's fate. Their bond grew not from words, but from survival. They shared meals in silence, worked side by side repairing the broken walls, and each night, as the prairie wind rattled the shutters, they endured the same unease together. Slowly, the cabin ceased to feel like a ruin. It became something else, fragile, unfinished but alive. And though neither of them dared to speak it, they both knew the truth. Loneliness had been their curse, but it no longer ruled the cabin. Yet peace in the West was always a fragile thing. One morning, as the sun crept over the horizon, the ranch hand noticed tracks in the dirt near the cabin. Fresh hoof prints, too close to dismiss. He crouched low, his fingers brushing the earth, his jaw tightening. Someone had been watching. And as he rose, his hand rested on the revolver at his side, the weight of it a grim reminder that no story in the frontier ever stayed simple for long. The discovery of the tracks unsettled him more than he let on. The ranch hand had lived long enough to know when danger circled, and this was no accident. Someone had come near, close enough to study the cabin, close enough to know it was no longer empty. He kept the knowledge to himself at first, watching the horizon with sharper eyes, his hand never straying far from his revolver. But the woman noticed the change in him, the way he lingered outside longer, the way his silence carried tension instead of calm. That night, as the firelight flickered across their faces, she pressed him for the truth. Reluctantly, he told her of the tracks, of the likelihood that someone was watching. Fear crossed her features, but not surprise. She admitted then that her past might not be as distant as she had hoped. The man who had betrayed her, she explained, was not the kind to let go easily. She had fled from him not only because of the lies, but because he carried a cruelty that left no space for escape. If he had found her trail, then the danger she had tried to outrun had now reached the cabin. The ranch hand listened without flinching, his jaw set, his eyes steady. He had lived his life, avoiding the burdens of others, choosing solitude to escape the weight of bonds that could be broken. But as she spoke, he realized that her danger was now his as well, not by chance, but by choice. When he opened that door, he had stepped into her story, and there was no stepping back. He told her firmly, "If he comes, he won't take this place." His words were few, but they landed with the weight of a vow. The days that followed were filled with preparation. The ranch hand strengthened the fences, repaired the cabin door, and set his rifle where he could reach it quickly. The woman helped where she could, her hands busy with tasks, her eyes carrying a new determination. She was no longer just a wanderer seeking shelter. She was a mother of her own survival, shaping the home she had stumbled into, refusing to let fear define her life again. And yet, beneath their preparations, something deeper grew. Each shared glance, each quiet moment of trust, stitched them closer together. What had begun as an accident of fate was becoming something neither could deny. They were no longer two exiles bound only by chance. They were becoming a shield for one another, forged not in ease but in the fire of the West's relentless trials. And as the prairie stretched silent under the stars, both of them knew the same truth. The storm was coming, but they would face it together. The storm announced itself in whispers before it ever struck. Riders were spotted on the horizon, dust rising behind them like a warning. The ranch hand watched from the porch, his gaze narrowing as the figures drew nearer, then circling back into the hills. They did not approach, not yet, but their presence was enough to darken the days that followed. Every creak of the cabin, every howl of wind against the shutters, carried with it the weight of anticipation. The woman, clutching her shawl tighter, asked no questions. She already knew who the riders were, and who they followed. The ranch hand prepared in silence. He oiled his revolver, set extra firewood near the hearth, and walked the perimeter of the cabin each dusk, leaving nothing to chance. Yet with every step, the truth pressed harder upon him. This fight would not be about land or cattle, but about the stranger whose presence had already rewritten his life. He had bought a cabin for a few coins, expecting solitude. What he had received was a battle he had not chosen, but one he would not abandon. Inside, the woman found herself torn between fear and guilt. She knew her past had brought this danger to his doorstep, that the peace he had sought was now shattered because of her. More than once she told him she should leave, her voice trembling as she offered to walk into the night and spare him the burden. But the ranch hand's answer was always the same, a quiet, unyielding no. It was not said with anger, but with the steady finality of a man who had made his choice long ago, when he first opened that door. At night, as the fire crackled and the shadows danced across the cabin walls, the tension softened, if only for a moment. The woman told him stories of her childhood, of summers spent chasing wildflowers before life had hardened her hands. He listened without interruption, her words pulling threads of warmth through the cold silence. He rarely spoke of his own past, but his eyes betrayed the truths he did not voice. That loneliness had been his only companion, and that in her presence, he had remembered what it meant to share a table, to hear another's laughter, to feel life echo in his home again. But the prairie does not forgive warmth for long. One evening, as the sky burned crimson with the setting sun, the riders came closer, their shadows stretching long against the earth. The ranch hand stood at the threshold of his cabin, revolver at his side, the woman behind him clutching the doorframe. The west had sent its storm, and he knew with absolute certainty that this cabin, once bought for so little, was about to cost him everything he had. The riders arrived under the cloak of night, their torches burning like angry stars against the black sky. There were 4 of them, their laughter carrying cruel and sharp through the wind as they dismounted at the edge of the ranch. The woman froze, her heart pounding, recognizing the voice of the one who led them, a voice that once whispered promises, now barking threats into the darkness. The ranch hand's hand tightened around his revolver, but his stance was calm, measured. This was not his first standoff, though it was the first that mattered beyond himself. The leader stepped forward, his boots crunching over the dirt, his torch painting the night with fire. His words cut through the silence, mocking and venomous, demanding the woman be given up, declaring her nothing more than a possession stolen from him. His laughter was echoed by the men at his back, a chorus of cruelty that rattled through the prairie night. But the ranch hand did not flinch. He stood in the doorway, broad and steady, his revolver low but ready, his silence heavier than their threats. The woman clutched his arm, her voice breaking as she whispered for him to let her go. She would walk into the night, face her fate, if it meant sparing him. But the ranch hand only shook his head, his eyes never leaving the men before him. "This is my land," he said at last, his voice low but sharp as steel, "and no one takes what stands under my roof." The words fell into the night like thunder, silencing even the cruel laughter. For the first time, the rider saw not a lonely ranch hand, but a man who had found something worth dying for. The standoff stretched on, the fire from their torches flickering against the walls of the cabin. The prairie seemed to hold its breath, the wind itself pausing to see what would unfold. The leader sneered, spitting into the dirt, and for a moment it seemed the night would erupt into blood and fire. But the ranch hand's presence, calm, unbroken, immovable, forced hesitation into their hearts. They had expected fear, expected weakness. What they found instead was resolve, so sharp it cut deeper than any blade. With a curse, the leader turned, signaling his men to retreat. Their torches vanished into the darkness, their laughter fading into the hills, leaving behind only silence. The ranch hand lowered his revolver, his chest heaving though his face remained steady. Behind him, the woman wept quietly, not from fear, but from the overwhelming truth she now knew. He had not only defended her, he had chosen her. And in that choice, the old cabin, once worthless, had become something far greater than either of them had ever imagined. The prairie was quiet again, but the silence was no longer the same. It carried with it the weight of what had just passed, the echo of men who might return with greater fury. The ranch hand knew this peace was only borrowed time, yet he also knew a line had been drawn. He had stood in the doorway and claimed the woman as his own to protect, and in doing so, he had sealed his fate. The cabin he had bought for a handful of coins was no longer merely his shelter. It was the fortress of a bond forged in the fire of the frontier. Inside, the woman tended to the fire with trembling hands, the glow illuminating the tracks of tears on her cheeks. She said little, but the gratitude in her eyes was louder than any words. For so long she had lived as though her life held no value, as though she were nothing more than a burden to be cast aside. Yet here was a man who, without promise of reward, without hesitation, had chosen to stand for her. That choice reshaped her sense of worth more than any kindness she had ever known. The ranch hand busied himself with repairs the next morning, his movements methodical. He patched the fences, reinforced the cabin door, and ensured every bullet was clean and ready. He did not speak of the riders or of the danger still looming, but the woman could see it written in his silence. His quiet was not avoidance. It was preparation. He was a man who had faced storms and loss before, and he understood better than most that the frontier never left debts unpaid. But amidst the work, a fragile rhythm of life continued. The woman began planting herbs along the window, using seeds she had carried with her for miles. The scent of fresh earth and green shoots mingled with the smell of smoke, filling the cabin with the faint promise of renewal. The ranch hand found himself pausing to watch her, his hardened expression softening for just a moment. For the first time in years, his home carried more than dust and silence. It carried growth. Still, beneath this fragile hope, the question gnawed at them both. How long could this last? The West was not a land that allowed peace to endure without a fight. The tracks left by those riders were etched, not only into the soil, but into the story of their lives. The woman feared it, the man accepted it, but both understood the same truth. When the storm returned, they would face it together. The town soon caught wind of what had happened. Whispers spilled through the saloon, across the blacksmith forge, and along the church pews. Some called the ranch hand a fool for risking his life over a stranger, while others spoke with grudging respect of his defiance. In the West, a man's name was often carried by the stories others told of him, and already his had begun to change. No longer just the solitary rancher who lived at the edge of the prairie. He was now the man who had stood against riders in the night to protect a woman no one else had claimed. The widow, when she ventured into town, felt the sting of stares and the bite of whispers. Yet she also felt something she had not in years: protection. Though people still judged, they judged from a distance, careful not to cross the man who now stood at her side. She walked with her head held higher, not because the weight of exile had vanished, but because she was no longer carrying it alone. The ranch hand's silent presence was shield enough against the world's cruelty. Back at the cabin, the two of them built routines that tethered them to one another. She cooked meals that softened the edge of his long days. He repaired the land with a determination that hinted at something beyond mere survival. Evenings became their time of fragile peace, the firelight flickering, the woman's soft humming filling the air, the ranch hand sitting near the table, polishing his revolver in silence. Each unspoken gesture stitched them closer together, like threads woven into a quilt neither of them had expected to share. Yet danger lingered like a shadow at the edge of the horizon. The ranch hand knew men like the one who had come for her. They did not accept defeat. They waited, planned, and returned with greater fury. Each day he scanned the distance, his instincts sharpened, his resolve hardening like steel. He had fought for himself many times before, but this was different. This was no longer about solitude or pride. This was about defending the fragile life that had taken root inside the cabin's walls. One evening, as the stars stretched endless across the black sky, the woman spoke softly, almost to herself. I used to believe no place in this world could hold me, but now this cabin feels like home. Her words lingered in the quiet, filling the ranch hand with something he could not name. He looked at her, at the flicker of the fire dancing in her eyes, and though he said nothing, his silence carried the truth. Home was no longer a place he had bought. It was the people he had chosen to keep within its walls. Winter settled over the prairie with a heavy hand, the snow piling against the cabin walls, the winds howling like ghosts across the empty plains. For many, it was a season of hardship, of hunger, of quiet despair. But within the old cabin, something unexpected thrived. The woman's laughter, rare but real, softened the sharp edges of the cold, and the crackling fire no longer burned only for warmth but for the life that had been built around it. The ranch hand, long accustomed to silence, found himself listening for the sound of her footsteps, the rustle of her voice. In the heart of winter, the cabin no longer felt abandoned. It felt alive. But peace in the West was never more fragile than in the stillness of snow. Tracks appeared once more at the edge of the property, pressed deep into the frost, the marks of horses circling but never approaching. The ranch hand studied them in silence, his jaw tight, his breath steaming in the cold air. Whoever watched from the hills had not given up. They were waiting, biding their time, perhaps testing his resolve. The woman, seeing the tension in his eyes, asked no questions, but fear clung to her all the same. The days dragged long, each sunrise bringing both relief and dread. The ranch hand spent hours repairing tools, checking fences buried beneath drifts, and ensuring that no weakness left them vulnerable. The woman, though she busied herself with tending the fire and cooking meals from their meager stores, carried a strength of her own. Her presence reminded him that what he was defending was not simply survival. It was a life worth fighting for. In her, he saw resilience as fierce as any gunslinger's courage. At night, when the world outside was swallowed by darkness and snow, the two shared the kind of quiet that said more than words. The woman sometimes told stories of her past, not of sorrow, but of moments long buried, of wildflower fields, of warm summers before betrayal turned her heart cold. The ranch hand rarely spoke of his own, but when he did, it was in fragments: a lost brother, a father's harsh lessons, the endless weight of solitude. Together, they stitched their fragments into something whole, something unspoken but deeply understood. And still, in the back of his mind, the ranch hand knew the truth: the riders would return. Winter might keep them at bay, but snow melted, and hunger drove men harder than any storm. He lay awake many nights, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing, staring at the beams above, and promising himself one thing: when the storm came again, he would not let the cabin fall. Spring broke at last, the snow giving way to green fields and restless winds. The prairie stretched wide and endless, alive again with the promise of new beginnings. The woman planted small shoots in the soil near the cabin, her hands working with care, as though each sprout was a vow to remain. The ranch hand watched her quietly, the weight of the revolver at his side a reminder that life in the West was never secure. But watching her smile faintly at the sight of new life stirring from the earth, he felt something he had not known in years: hope. That hope was tested when the riders returned, their figures black against the bright horizon. This time, there was no mocking laughter, no circling games. They came with purpose, their eyes set on reclaiming what they believed was theirs. The leader dismounted first, his cruel grin unchanged, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. He called for the woman, his voice sharp, demanding, certain of victory. But the ranch hand stepped forward, his stance steady, his silence heavier than words. The confrontation that followed was a battle not only of guns, but of will. The ranch hand fought with the precision of a man who knew every breath might be his last. Each shot fired not for pride, but for the life inside the cabin. The woman, though trembling, refused to cower, her eyes never leaving the man who had chosen her as his cause. The prairie echoed with the crack of revolvers, the cries of men, and then, at last, silence. When the dust settled, the riders lay broken on the earth, their cruelty ended by the will of one man who refused to surrender. The ranch hand stood tall, smoke curling from his revolver, his chest heaving, but his eyes clear. Behind him, the woman stepped from the cabin, her hand resting lightly on his arm. In that moment, they both understood. The West had tested them, had thrown every cruelty it could summon, and yet within the walls of that forgotten cabin, they had built something no bullet could destroy. The cabin, bought for only a few coins, had become far more than a shelter. It was a fortress of defiance, a cradle of resilience, and, above all, a home. In its worn beams and patched roof, it carried not just survival, but the story of two souls who had found each other when both had been cast aside. And as the prairie winds whispered through the grass, it became clear that the cabin's true worth had never been in its wood or stone, but in the life and the love that now lived within its walls. In the end, what began as a simple bargain, a few coins exchanged for an abandoned cabin, became something no man could ever put a price on. The ranch hand had stepped into those weathered walls seeking solitude, but instead found a stranger whose presence reshaped the course of his life. What was once hollow and broken grew into a place of resilience, where laughter and defiance stood against the cruelty of the West. It was proof that even the smallest choices can open doors to the greatest of destinies. The woman, cast aside by betrayal, discovered within those rough-hewn walls not only safety but dignity restored. She was no longer a shadow moving from place to place, but a part of something greater, chosen, defended, and given the chance to plant roots where none had existed before. Her survival was no longer marked by fear, but by belonging. The cabin, with its patched roof and scarred beams, became a symbol of her redemption. For the ranch hand, the story was deeper still. Years of silence had taught him that loneliness was the only shield strong enough to survive the West. Yet the moment he chose to protect, the moment he refused to abandon another soul, his silence cracked, and within it, he rediscovered purpose. He became more than a man guarding his land. He became a guardian of life, a protector of hope. The old cabin did not merely house him. It gave him back to himself. The West was unforgiving, and it always would be. But this tale leaves behind a truth that lingers long after the fire has dimmed. Strength is not measured by how fiercely one stands alone, but by how far one will go to defend what stands within their care. A door once opened to an unwanted stranger had instead opened to belonging, to family, to love, reminding us all that sometimes the greatest treasures come disguised as burdens. If this story stirred something in you, share what it made you feel in the comments below, whether it reminded you of resilience, of unexpected bonds, or of the power of choosing not to stand alone. And if you wish to continue walking through these timeless tales of the West, where every silence hides a story and every choice becomes a legend, make sure to like this video and subscribe. That way, you'll always be here when the next fire is lit and another story waits to be told.